The mornings in our house had a certain kind of silence. Not the peaceful, gentle kind that makes you feel safe. No, it was the heavy, sticky kind of silence that settled into the corners of the kitchen like dust. Too polite to demand attention but too present to ignore. I stood by the sink drying a glass I knew no one had used, staring at the marble countertop, spotless cold beneath my fingertips even through the thin fabric of my blouse. The sun outside was bright enough to make the silver faucet gleam, but the light felt distant. Untouched. David kissed me on the cheek before leaving. Always on the cheek. Always the same place, the same routine, the same soft words that hung in the air long after the door clicked shut behind him. "I'll be back late. Don't wait up." I smiled the way I was supposed to smile. I meant it. I meant every polite nod, every careful thank you, every small gesture that kept the house running as smoothly as he wanted. It wasn't that he was cruel. He wasn't. He was kind, steady, a man who never raised his voice, never gave a reason to doubt his devotion. And yet the space between us had become too soft, too safe, a place where desire had nowhere to cling. There's something about stability that after a while can feel like standing still for too long in one place. Even the air around you grows stale. I wasn't looking for trouble. I never told myself that story. I wasn't the kind of woman who needed chaos. But I had become the kind of woman who missed the feeling of being truly seen, of being looked at like a woman, not just a partner, not just the person who remembered to buy his favorite bread or kept the laundry folded the way he liked. There's a difference between being loved and being wanted. And I had started to forget what the second one felt like. It was Friday evening. We were all gathered at David's parents' house in Willow Creek as usual. The big dining table, the polished wood, the quiet clinking of plates and glasses, conversations that floated around polite topics, weather, work, the next family event. I sat there smiling when I was supposed to, nodding at the right moments. I could feel the weight of my necklace resting against my collarbone. A small chain I had chosen carefully that morning. It didn't match the simplicity of my dress, but I wore it anyway as if it might catch someone's eye. I caught Richard's instead. It wasn't intentional. I looked up from my plate and his gaze was already there, steady, patient, the father of my husband. Older by decades, his features lined by time, his shoulders still broad beneath the crisp fabric of his shirt. He sat at the head of the table as he always did, his voice calm, measured, asking about my week, about the garden, about things that should have felt innocent. But there was something in the way his eyes held mine just a breath too long. Later after dinner I offered to help clear the table. Habit, really. I gathered the plates, stacked them carefully, brought them into the kitchen where Richard was already leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching me. There was no one else in the room. The others were still sitting, finishing their wine, talking softly. I moved past him to set the dishes in the sink. His hand brushed against mine. Light, deliberate, just enough to make me freeze. I didn't pull away. His eyes stayed on my face, unblinking. There was no apology in his expression. No nervous laugh to cover the moment. Just the quiet certainty of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. "You've become even more beautiful," he said. Low, measured, like a fact, not a compliment. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My fingers tightened around the rim of the plate I was holding. The porcelain suddenly too slick beneath my skin. It should have been nothing. A passing remark, a casual observation from an older man who had maybe had one glass of wine too many. But it wasn't nothing. I felt the words settle into me like a pebble dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching places inside me I hadn't realized were waiting to be disturbed. The rest of the evening blurred. I stayed longer than I needed to, pretended to listen as the conversation drifted from one harmless topic to another. But every time I caught Richard's eyes across the room, there it was again. That look, like he wasn't asking for anything, like he already knew. By the time we said our goodbyes, my heart was racing. I kissed David on the cheek as always. We thanked his parents for dinner. Promised to come again soon. But as I stepped through the doorway to leave, I felt the weight of Richard's gaze on my back. Not demanding, not desperate, just there. And for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, I found myself hoping it would be there again. I told myself that it was just a moment, a strange little slip, an accident of timing, nothing more. But the words had already sunk into the soft parts of me, the ones I had worked so hard to keep untouched. I felt them the next morning washing over me as I folded the laundry, as I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair back into place. They stayed with me when David wrapped his arms around my waist in the kitchen, kissed the side of my head, asked me about my plans for the day. "I left some papers at my father's," he said casually, sipping his coffee. "Could you drop them off on your way to the store?" It was an ordinary request, the kind of errand I had run 100 times before without thinking twice. But that morning the thought of standing in that kitchen again, of walking into that house in Willow Creek knowing Richard might be there alone, made my stomach twist in a way that was hard to name. I told myself I wouldn't stay long. I chose my outfit carefully, more carefully than made sense for such a simple delivery: a fitted blouse, soft cream against my skin, tucked into a skirt that clung just a little too well at the hips, practical enough to dismiss any suspicion, but close enough to the line that I felt a flicker of something when I caught my own reflection before leaving the house. I told myself it was habit, vanity, nothing more. The drive to Willow Creek felt longer than usual. The streets looked the same. Familiar turns, the same little shops and front yards that I'd passed 100 times before. But my hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. And I caught myself checking the rear-view mirror more often than necessary. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked as still and calm as always. The same neat hedges, the same well-kept lawn. But my chest tightened as I stepped out of the car. The folder of papers pressed flat against my palm. The door was already open when I knocked. And there Richard was standing just inside, sleeves rolled up, collar loose, hands streaked with some kind of oil or dust from whatever project he had been working on in the garage. There was no surprise in his expression. No curiosity about why I had come instead of his son. "Come in," he said, simply stepping aside. I crossed the threshold, feeling the air shift between us. The house smelled faintly of wood and leather. A little warmer than ours, less polished somehow, but solid. Real. "I brought the papers," I said, holding them out like a shield. He didn't take them right away. His eyes stayed on me, steady, unreadable. Then slowly he reached for the folder, his fingers brushing against mine as he did. Not a clumsy touch, not accidental. The contact was deliberate, patient, the way one might handle a delicate object that could shatter if pushed too hard. "You didn't have to come yourself," he said, voice calm, almost conversational. I shrugged, tried to keep my smile easy. "It was on my way." He nodded, setting the folder down on the table behind him without looking away. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick, charged like the air before a storm. "Would you like some tea?" he asked after a moment. I should have said no. I should have made some polite excuse and left. But instead I heard myself say, "Sure." I followed him into the kitchen, watched as he moved through the space with the kind of ease that comes from long years in the same house. His hands were steady, measured, every gesture quiet, restrained. "Sugar?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "No thank you." The small clink of the spoon against the ceramic cup was louder than it should have been. I wrapped my fingers around the warmth of the mug when he handed it to me, grateful for something to hold on to. We stood there for a moment, the two of us sipping tea in silence. I tried to focus on the ordinary things. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the curtains as the breeze moved through the open window. But the awareness of Richard standing so close, pressed against my skin like a weight. When he set his cup down, he didn't move away. His hand reached out, slow, careful, fingertips brushing against my wrist. The smallest gesture, barely there, but my breath caught in my throat. I didn't step back. His hand moved higher, tracing the inside of my arm, the curve of my elbow. His touch was light, unhurried, as if he were waiting for me to protest. I didn't. I felt my own hand drift toward him, resting lightly against the front of his shirt, the fabric soft beneath my fingers, warm from his body beneath. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. The space between us closed in an instant. His mouth found mine. Not rough, not forceful, but sure. Measured like he had all the time in the world to explore the taste of me. His lips pressed against mine with a kind of certainty that unraveled something deep inside, something I hadn't realized was still holding together. I felt the warmth of his hand along my waist, the careful pressure of his fingers as they traced the line of my back. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as though he were memorizing the shape of my lips, the curve of my mouth. When he finally pulled away, his eyes stayed on me, studying, waiting. I didn't speak. I couldn't trust my voice. He reached out gently, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering just a moment too long along the side of my face. "You didn't have to come," he said again. Softer this time. But we both knew why I had. I didn't sleep well that night. The bed felt too wide, the sheets too crisp beneath my skin. I turned from one side to the other, listening to the soft, even breathing of David beside me. His body, familiar, solid, radiated the quiet warmth of a man at peace. A man who trusted the person sleeping next to him without question. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness above me pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake off. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of that kiss on my lips. The steady grip of Richard's hand on my waist. The way his fingers had lingered against my skin, unhurried, certain, not a question in his touch, an invitation. And worse than the memory itself was the ache it left behind. The ache that told me how long it had been since I had felt anything like that, since anyone had touched me, not out of habit, not out of duty, but with hunger. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. I repeated the words like a prayer as I watched the slow crawl of headlights slide across the bedroom wall from the street outside. But the problem with prayers is that they only work if you mean them. The next morning, David kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work. His hand rested on my shoulder for a moment, fingers pressing gently, almost absent-mindedly, before he reached for his keys and walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen long after he was gone, watching the steam rise from my untouched coffee, feeling the silence settle back into the house like it belonged there. I went through the motions of my day: laundry, groceries, the usual errands, moving on autopilot, while my mind kept circling back to the same place, to that kitchen, to the quiet pull in Richard's voice when he spoke to me. To the way my body had leaned into him before my mind could catch up. It would have been easy to let it stop there. A moment of weakness, a mistake I could lock away and forget. But easy has never been my strong suit. The message I sent Richard wasn't long. Just a line. Simple. Careful. "I think I left something at your place. The folder. May I swing by later to pick it up?" A lie so small it barely felt like one. The folder, of course, was sitting exactly where I had put it the day before, tucked neatly on the table by the front door. But the words gave me a reason. A door half open. His reply came quickly. "Of course. I'll be here." No questions, no assumptions, just permission. I spent the rest of the afternoon telling myself I wouldn't go. I rearranged the living room bookshelves just to keep my hands busy, reorganized the spice rack in the kitchen, folded towels I had already folded the day before. But when the sun began to dip behind the trees outside and the air turned cooler, I was already slipping on my shoes, keys in hand, purse over my shoulder. I chose a different blouse this time. Soft blue buttons, low enough to suggest but not announce. The kind of choice that made me feel like I could still call this innocent, even as my hands shook while fastening the tiny pearl at my throat. The drive to Willow Creek felt shorter this time. Or maybe I was simply too focused on what was waiting at the end of it to notice the distance. When Richard opened the door, he looked at me the same way he had the day before. Calm, steady, like he had known I would come back. "I left the folder by the table," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. I stepped inside. The folder was there just as he said. I could have reached for it, thanked him, walked away. But my feet didn't move toward the door. They moved toward him. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt electric, charged in a way that made every breath feel too loud, every heartbeat too sharp. He watched me, waited. No rush, no assumptions. It was me who stepped closer. I felt my hand rise without permission, fingers tracing the line of his forearm rough beneath my touch. He didn't flinch, didn't move. Just let me close the space between us until there was nowhere left to go. When he reached for me, it wasn't hurried. His hand came to rest at the small of my back, steady, firm, anchoring me in place. His other hand brushed the side of my face, fingers gentle as they tucked my hair behind my ear. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, voice low. I wasn't sure either, I answered. The kiss came slower this time, softer, less about hunger, more about curiosity. Like he was taking the time to learn me, to feel the shape of my mouth beneath his. My hands found the buttons of his shirt, fingertips grazing the warm skin beneath, feeling the rise and fall of his breath against my palms. It wasn't frantic. There was no desperation in the way we moved, only the quiet, careful recognition of two people standing too close to the edge to pretend they weren't going to fall. When we finally broke apart, I stayed close enough to feel the heat of him against me. His hand still rested at my waist, fingers pressing lightly into the fabric of my skirt. I should go, I whispered. He didn't try to stop me. Just let his fingers slide away slowly, one by one, as I stepped back. The folder sat untouched on the table. As I turned toward the door, I reached for it, grasped the edge too tightly, my knuckles white against the paper. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face like a slap, waking me from whatever spell I had let myself fall under. But even as I drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I knew I would come back. There is something dangerous about silence when it starts to feel comfortable, about the way temptation softens its edges the more familiar it becomes. I told myself I had crossed a line, that what had happened should have left me shaken enough to stop. But the truth settled into me quietly, like warm water poured into an empty glass, filling spaces I hadn't realized were hollow. I spent the next few days moving through my life like nothing had changed, smiling where I was supposed to, asking David about his work, nodding as he told me about his meetings and plans for the week. He was gentle with me, as always, thoughtful in all the ways a good man should be, but his eyes never wandered across my body the way Richard's did. His hands touched me with care, not hunger. I found myself paying attention to the way I dressed in the mornings, to the soft cling of fabric at my waist, to the line of my collarbone beneath a fitted blouse. I caught my reflection more often than I wanted to admit, lingering just a moment longer before turning away. I wondered quietly who I was dressing for. It was late on a Wednesday evening when David suggested we take some time for ourselves. A small trip, just the two of us. A night away from the routine, from the familiar walls of our home in Willow Creek. I made a reservation, he told me as we sat together after dinner, his hand reaching for mine across the table. Just one night. I thought it might be good for us. I smiled, nodded, agreed. I told myself this was exactly what we needed. I told myself I wanted to try. We drove out the following afternoon, a short distance outside Willow Creek, to one of those quiet, well-kept hotels meant for business travelers and weekend escapes. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Our room was spacious, neat, with a wide window that looked out over the garden and a soft white comforter smoothed perfectly across the bed. David was sweet, careful, unpacking my things for me, asking if I wanted to go down for dinner or stay in. I watched him move through the space, his familiar habits, the small kindnesses he never forgot. And the more I watched, the heavier the guilt pressed against my ribs. That night we dressed for the hotel restaurant. David in a buttoned shirt and slacks, me in a black dress I hadn't worn in months. It fit closer than I remembered, the fabric hugging the curve of my hips, dipping low at the back. I caught his eyes scanning me as I fastened the delicate clasp of my necklace. A small flicker of appreciation there. "You look beautiful," he said softly. I smiled. I meant the smile. But beneath it something else stirred. The dinner was pleasant. The conversation easy. We talked about the garden, about work, about plans for the summer. And all the while I could feel the weight of the dress against my skin, the faint press of the fabric reminding me of other hands, other eyes. Back in the room, David reached for me, his hands gentle on my shoulders, sliding down my arms, pulling me toward him with the same careful affection he had always given. His lips found mine soft, tender, the kind of kiss that belongs to people who know each other too well. Safe, predictable. I kissed him back because I wanted to want him. I kissed him back because I knew he deserved that much. But my body stayed quiet beneath his touch, the ache inside me untouched by the sweetness of his hands. When he pulled me closer, fingers tracing the zipper of my dress, I felt my mind drift not to guilt, not even to fear, but to the shape of another hand at my waist, to the steady, certain pressure of lips against mine that had not asked for permission but had known they would not be denied. I let David undress me that night. I let him love me the way he always did, with kindness, with care, with the kind of routine that should have felt like comfort, but my body betrayed me with its silence. I felt him, but I didn't feel myself. After I lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of David's breath as he drifted into sleep beside me. The room was dark except for the thin line of moonlight cutting across the floor from the window. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up too brightly against the night. The message I sent was shorter than I intended. Are you awake? I held my breath as I watched the screen, as though the glow of it might give me away. The reply came faster than I deserved. I am now. There were no pleasantries between us, no games, only the quiet honesty of two people who had already said more with their bodies than they ever had with words. I'm at the hotel outside of Willow Creek, I typed. Room 207. There was a pause, then simply, I know the place. I slipped out of bed quietly, the sheets barely rustling as I moved. David stirred but did not wake. I stood at the window for a moment, watching the darkness outside, feeling the cool press of the glass beneath my palm. When my phone buzzed again, it was just 2 words. Come down. I wrapped myself in the hotel robe, tying it loosely at the waist. The hallway was silent as I stepped out, the soft click of the door closing behind me the only sound in the stillness. The elevator hummed as it carried me down, my heart beating too fast beneath the thin fabric against my chest. Richard was already waiting outside by his car, parked beneath the glow of the street light at the far end of the lot. I could see the shape of him leaning against the door, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jacket, the other holding a cigarette between his fingers, though the tip burned low, forgotten. I crossed the distance between us slowly, my bare legs brushing against the robe as I walked, the belt slipping just slightly looser at my waist. When I stopped in front of him, he didn't speak. He reached out instead, fingers catching the edge of the robe where it had begun to fall open, his eyes never leaving mine. His hand closed around my wrist, drawing me toward him with a quiet insistence that left no space for questions. His mouth found mine again, and this time there was no patience in the kiss, no careful restraint, only hunger. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there after. Long enough for the cool night air to dry the sweat at the base of my neck. Long enough to feel the dull ache of my pulse still hammering beneath my skin. I leaned against the passenger side of his car, the rough metal warm from the day's heat. My hands gripping the edge of the door like an anchor. He didn't say a word. He just stood there watching me, arms crossed over his chest, as if patience had always been his strongest suit. It wasn't patience, it was certainty. I tied the robe tighter around my waist before sliding down into the seat, the fabric sticking faintly against my thighs. The smell of leather inside the car, faintly mixed with the smoke of the cigarette he had let die between his fingers, filled the space between us. I could feel the weight of his stare even when I turned my head away, pretending to look out the window. The parking lot was empty save for a few scattered vehicles near the hotel entrance. The quiet hum of distant traffic floated somewhere on the edge of the night. You know this can't stop now, Richard said. His voice was low. Even. I didn't answer. Not right away. There was nothing to argue with in those words. No accusation, no plea. Only the obvious truth we had both already accepted long before he spoke it out loud. I could have lied. I could have told him it was a mistake, that I didn't mean for it to happen again. But the lie tasted too sour even in the back of my throat. Instead I nodded, once, eyes still on the window. The drive back to the hotel took less than 5 minutes. Long enough for my heart to slow back to something that resembled normal. Long enough for guilt to try to edge its way in. for the familiar rhythm of doubt to tap at my thoughts. But when I stepped out of the car, when I felt Richard's hand brush lightly across my lower back as he held the door for me, none of that stayed. Inside the elevator, the silence between us felt like another kind of conversation, one we were too far into to back away from. Now the doors opened with a soft chime on my floor, and I turned toward him, hesitating just a moment before stepping out. "You should go," I said. His eyes didn't flinch. His expression didn't shift. "Tell me to." The words hung there heavy, waiting. I didn't. I turned and walked back toward my room, fingers trembling just enough to fumble with the key card when I reached the door. Behind me I heard the quiet steps follow. Inside the room the air was cooler than I remembered. The faint hum of the air conditioner filling the quiet. The white sheets of the bed glowed faintly beneath the moonlight spilling through the half-open curtains. David was still asleep, body turned toward the window, his back rising and falling with each even breath. The knot of my robe loosened beneath my fingers as I crossed the floor. I dropped it silently onto the chair by the window, the soft whisper of fabric against leather the only sound in the room. I slipped beneath the covers, pressing my body lightly against David's back, my arm draped carefully over his waist. He stirred only slightly, reaching for my hand, and his sleep fingers threading through mine with the ease of habit. I closed my eyes and let him hold my hand. But my mind stayed elsewhere. The next morning came quietly, sunlight creeping into the room through the thin curtains, the light soft and forgiving. I felt the warmth of David's hand along my hip as he woke. Fingers tracing the curve of my side beneath the sheets. His touch was gentle, familiar, the kind of affection that speaks of years spent knowing each other's rhythms. We made love that morning. I tried. I let his hands move over me. Let his mouth find the places he knew I liked. I arched my back when he expected me to. Offered soft where they belonged. But my body was only going through the motions. My mind too full of other hands, other mouths, other heat. I smiled at him after, kissed him softly, ran my fingers through his hair the way he loved, told him it was good, and he smiled back at me. Trusting, always trusting. Later, as he stepped into the shower, I sat at the edge of the bed, running my thumb along the line of my collarbone, the skin there still warm beneath my touch. I picked up my phone. There was already a message waiting. "You left your scarf." I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. The scarf, soft gray cashmere, had slipped from my lap sometime in the car, left behind on the seat where my fingers had clutched it like a lifeline. I typed back, "Keep it." There was a pause before Richard's reply came. "Then come back for it." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of polite smiles and small talk as we checked out of the hotel. David chatting easily with the woman at the front desk, asking about the best route back into Willow Creek. I stood beside him, nodding where I needed to, folding my hands neatly in front of me. But inside the ache stayed. On the drive home, David reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine as he drove. I held on tightly, but I felt the space growing between our palms even as our hands remained clasped together. It wasn't anger that settled into me then, not shame, it was need, and I knew I was already planning the next time. The scarf stayed on my mind longer than I cared to admit. A small thing, really. Soft fabric, barely a whisper of weight when worn. And yet it felt heavier in memory than it ever did around my neck. It wasn't the object itself. Of course, it was the way it had been left behind. The way Richard had chosen not to return it, the way he had asked me to come back for it, as though we both knew it was never about the scarf at all. I stared at his message more times than I could count before deleting it. But the words had already carved out a place inside me. They were there when I folded laundry. When I stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables for dinner, when I felt David's hand settle casually at the small of my back while he reached past me for a glass from the cupboard. His touch so familiar, so easy, so automatic that it barely stirred the air between us. I knew David sensed something. Not enough to ask, not enough to accuse, but enough to notice the way my attention drifted. The way my eyes stayed distant even as I smiled, the way my answers came just a second too late. He watched me, sometimes quietly, as though waiting for a crack to show. But he never pressed. His faith in me was something I had never earned but always accepted. A gift I was beginning to feel the weight of in ways I couldn't shake. It would have been easier if he had been cruel. If there had been blame to share, excuses to make. But there was nothing of the sort, only kindness, only care. And that made every step I took away from him feel all the more deliberate. I told myself I would not reach out again. Told myself I would let the silence do the work of undoing what had started. But the lie unraveled the moment I felt the tightness in my chest growing unbearable. The hunger had rooted too deeply. It was no longer about choice. It had become a need. I waited 3 days before sending another message. A simple line. Safe on the surface. Are you home? The reply came almost instantly. Yes. I didn't ask if I could come by. I didn't need to. The invitation had been standing there between us, unspoken but understood. The drive to Willow Creek felt slower this time. My hands clutched the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale against the leather. The sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, leaving long shadows that stretched across the roads like reminders of the things we try to leave behind but never quite manage to outrun. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood quiet as ever. No other cars, no voices from inside, only the faint sound of the wind stirring the leaves in the trees above. Richard opened the door before I knocked, as though he had been standing there waiting. His shirt sleeves were rolled back at the elbows again. Forearms dusted faintly with what looked like sawdust or dirt from the work he had been doing in the garage. The sharp contrast between the roughness of his hands and the steadiness of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped inside without a word. The scarf was on the table, folded neatly, waiting. He didn't gesture toward it, didn't mention it at all. Instead, he watched me cross the room, his eyes tracking every movement, calm but fixed. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, humming with the quiet electricity of too many things left unsaid. When he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. His hand reached for mine, fingertips brushing lightly along my wrist before his fingers wrapped around it, fully holding me there. I wasn't sure if you would come, he said quietly. I wasn't sure either. The honesty of the words surprised me, but I didn't take them back. He pulled me toward him, the space between us closing with the inevitability of a tide coming in. His other hand rose to my face, thumb brushing along my jawline, the touch so light it barely registered at first. Then his lips were on mine again. This time more demanding, more certain, less about exploration, more about possession. I kissed him back because my body had stopped remembering how not to. I kissed him back because the weight of restraint had become too heavy to carry. His hands moved to my waist, fingers tightening as he pulled me closer. My body fitting against his as though it had always belonged there. The hard press of him against my hips left no question of his want. But it wasn't the physical hunger that broke me open. It was the way his mouth lingered at the corner of my lips. The way his breath warmed my skin as though he could taste the ache in me before I even gave it voice. I didn't resist when he turned me gently toward the wall, my back pressing against the cool surface. His body leaning into mine just enough to remind me of the choice I was making. His hand traced the line of my neck down to my collarbone, fingers slipping beneath the edge of my blouse, finding the delicate lace beneath. The small gasp that escaped my lips wasn't for him. It was for me. The sound of someone remembering how it feels to be wanted. When his lips found the hollow at the base of my throat, I felt my knees weaken beneath the weight of it. His mouth was sure, his movements unhurried, as though he had no doubt I would let him continue. And he was right. I let him explore the shape of me beneath the soft fabric of my clothes. His hands, steady as they mapped the places I had almost forgotten were still alive. His fingers brushed the clasp of my bra, pausing there, waiting. But I didn't stop him. The heat of his breath against my skin, the roughness of his palms against the softness of my body. It was too much and not enough all at once. When he finally pulled away, it wasn't with the kind of regret that should have followed. It was with the same quiet certainty that had drawn me here in the first place. I'll always be here, he said. The words settled into me like a promise I hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. I didn't take the scarf when I left. I didn't notice how quickly these meetings had begun to shape my days, how effortlessly they had carved out their space between the hours. At first there had been a hesitation, an awkward pause between the choice and the action. A small war waged silently beneath my ribs every time I found my fingers hovering over the keyboard before sending a message. Every time I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror and asked myself if I could still turn around. But hesitation has a way of softening when it repeats itself often enough. Guilt dulls at the edges when hunger grows louder. I started dressing differently, though I told myself otherwise. Small changes at first. A softer blouse, a skirt that fell just a little higher on my thighs, lipstick a shade deeper than my usual muted tones. Nothing too obvious, nothing David would question. But the mirror saw me clearly even when he did not. David had begun to notice the distance, though he didn't call it that. I watched the way his eyes lingered on me longer now when I moved about the house. The way his questions about my day had grown softer at the edges, more curious. I answered the same way I always had, steady, practiced. But there was something missing beneath my voice, and I could tell he was beginning to hear it. I wondered sometimes if it would be easier if he just asked, if he looked me in the eyes and demanded to know what had changed. But David was not the kind of man who expected betrayal. His love was the quiet, unwavering kind, the kind that believes loyalty is something given as naturally as breath. And that made the weight of my choices even heavier. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone buzzed again, Richard's name lighting up the screen. No words, just the familiar notification that left my pulse quickening beneath my skin. I shouldn't have gone. I knew that. But the knowing was no longer enough. I told David I was going out to pick up a few things for dinner. My voice steady, my smile soft. He kissed me goodbye, fingers brushing the side of my arm in that gentle way of his. I let him believe me. The drive to Willow Creek was almost mechanical now. Every turn familiar, every stoplight another small confession I swallowed down without speaking it aloud. When I pulled up outside the house, the garage door stood half open. The faint sound of music drifting out beneath the heavy afternoon air. Richard was there, as I knew he would be, shirt sleeves rolled, hands stained faintly with grease from whatever he had been working on. There was something about the way he stood, the easy confidence of his body leaning into the frame of the doorway, that felt so different from the world I lived in at home. He didn't need to ask why I was there. He never did. I stepped out of the car slowly, the heat of the pavement radiating up through the soles of my shoes. The scarf still sat folded neatly on the small bench near the door, untouched, waiting. It had become a quiet witness to what we had allowed ourselves to become. He didn't smile when he saw me, but there was something in his eyes that softened. Not surprise, not even satisfaction. Just the quiet acknowledgement that I had come back because I couldn't stay away. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I nodded once. "I know." Neither of us moved. The quiet between us had grown too familiar now to feel uncomfortable. It had become its own kind of conversation, one that spoke louder than words could. He gestured toward the side of the house where the sun fell lower across the narrow strip of garden that bordered the property. The flowers there were mostly wild, left to bloom without the careful attention I gave the plants at home. But they were beautiful in their own way, untamed, vivid, alive. I followed him, my footsteps slow, deliberate. I could feel the tension building with each step, the space between us thick with everything we weren't saying. When we stopped, he turned toward me, hands sliding into his pockets, eyes steady on mine. "I could make you stop," he said softly. I held his gaze. "But you won't." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even defiance. It was the truth. His hand reached out, fingers brushing along the edge of my jaw, tracing the line of my face with a tenderness that felt almost cruel in its softness. I leaned into the touch before I could stop myself. The kiss came slower this time, deeper, less urgency, more ache, like he was memorizing the taste of me, taking his time to claim what had already been offered. His hands moved down to my waist, fingers pressing into the curve of my hips, grounding me there. The roughness of his palms against the soft fabric of my blouse sent shivers up my spine, the contrast of textures lighting every nerve beneath my skin. I didn't resist when he guided me back against the wall of the house, the cool surface pressing into my back, his body closing the space between us with the ease of someone who knew I would not push him away. His lips found the line of my throat. His breath hot against my skin, and I felt myself break open beneath the weight of it. The soft sigh that escaped me was caught between his teeth, swallowed into the heat of his mouth. But it was the quiet between the touches that undid me most. The way his eyes searched mine between kisses. The way his fingers lingered at the edge of my blouse as if asking just barely if I was still choosing this. And I was. God help me, I was. When we finally pulled apart, my body trembling beneath the press of his hands, he didn't let me go fully. His forehead rested lightly against mine, our breaths tangled together in the small space between us. "You're not going to walk away from this," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I leaned back against the wall, my pulse still racing, my breath still shallow, and I knew he was right. I wasn't walking away. I never really had. I began to measure my days not by the clock, not by the softness of the morning light slipping through the bedroom curtains, but by the weight of the waiting, the hours between the last time I saw Richard and the next, the slow stretching ache of wanting, the hunger that no longer tried to disguise itself as doubt. It was never planned ahead. There were no promises of when, no appointments made, only the brief loaded messages, the knowing looks exchanged across a room, across the fence, at the family gatherings that still took place as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted. I watched myself from the outside, played the part one was meant to play with the ease of someone who had learned the script by heart, wife, daughter-in-law, polite, grateful, faithful. The performance made me sick sometimes, not because it was difficult but because it wasn't. The role fit too easily, and I hated how natural the lie had become. I could laugh at David's jokes over dinner. I could sit across from Richard at the same table, pour him a glass of wine, meet his eyes for just a second longer than I should have, feel the sharp pull deep in my belly, and still smile as though my hands weren't aching to touch him again. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the first real crack began to show. David stood by the kitchen window sipping his coffee, staring out at the garden. His words were soft, but they landed too hard. "You've been somewhere else lately." I froze where I stood, my back to him as I rinsed the dishes beneath the stream of warm water. My fingers tightened involuntarily around the rim of the plate in my hands. I didn't turn to face him right away. "What do you mean?" The words came out too light, too practiced. He didn't answer right away. I heard the soft clink of his mug as he set it down on the counter, the faint sigh that followed. When I finally turned, I found his eyes already on me, gentle, searching, uncertain. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But he wasn't. I smiled, soft, reassuring, the way I knew he needed me to. I crossed the floor, reached out, let my hand rest lightly against his chest, fingers tracing the line of the buttons on his shirt. I tilted my head just enough to meet his gaze, to lean up and kiss him softly, the kind of kiss that asks nothing and promises everything. And he let himself believe it because he wanted to. I spent the rest of that day folding into the rhythm of our life like nothing had changed. Grocery lists, small errands, the comfort of routine. But the moment David stepped out to run an errand of his own, I was already reaching for my phone. The message I sent was shorter than it should have been. "I need to see you." The reply came without delay. "Come." No place, no time. Just the single word, thick with the weight of all that sat beneath it. I found Richard in the same place he always waited. The garage door half open, the faint sound of music humming low beneath the quiet afternoon. He was working, or pretending to. The smell of sawdust and oil thick in the air. When I stepped inside, he didn't look up at first. His hands stayed busy, steady, as though he hadn't been waiting for me all along. But when he finally raised his head, when his eyes met mine across the room, I felt my knees weaken beneath the heat of that gaze. There was no smile, no greeting, only the weight of everything we'd been holding back. I crossed the floor slowly, deliberate, my hands fisted at my sides to keep them from reaching too soon. I stopped just short of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his skin, to smell the salt of his sweat mixed with the dust of the work. His hand rose to my face, fingers sliding along the line of my jaw, thumb brushing lightly across my lower lip. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, the ache of it sharper than I expected. "We're past the point of pretending," he said softly. I closed my eyes for half a second, the words slicing through me with the clean accuracy of a blade. "Yes," I whispered. "We are." It wasn't a kiss that followed. It was possession. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me flush against him. The hard press of his body leaving no space for denial. His mouth found my throat, teeth grazing the delicate skin there, not hard enough to mark but enough to remind me how easily he could. My breath caught in my chest, my fingers digging into his shoulders as though bracing for a fall I had already leapt into willingly. I felt the roughness of his palms beneath my blouse again, sliding up along my waist, lifting the fabric inch by inch until the cool air kissed my skin. I didn't stop him. My body had stopped knowing how to resist him long ago. But it wasn't the hunger in his hands that undid me. It was the look in his eyes when he paused just briefly, long enough to search my face to see if I would flinch, if I would turn away, and when I didn't. When I leaned into him, gave him everything he already knew I would. His mouth crushed against mine with the force of the answer he'd been waiting for. Every touch burned. Every kiss tasted like surrender. When we finally broke apart, our bodies trembling against each other, his hands still wrapped tightly around my wrists. He didn't let go right away. "I won't stop," he said, voice rough, uneven. "Tell me if you want me to." I didn't. I couldn't. I leaned my forehead against his chest, my breath shallow, my body too spent to lie. I was never going to tell him to stop. There is a certain weight to the moment when you realize there's no way back. Not because you've crossed a line. That happened long ago, but because you've stepped so far beyond it that the line itself has disappeared, swallowed whole by the choices you kept telling yourself were temporary, accidental, survivable. By the time autumn crept toward the edges of Willow Creek, casting longer shadows across the familiar streets, I had stopped telling myself stories about where this was going. There was no room left for excuses. No more soft language to cushion the truth. What was between us had grown too rooted, too certain. The need had become part of me, stitched into the skin beneath my clothes, humming low beneath every breath I took. At home the air felt thinner. Conversations with David slipped easily into habit. Familiar questions, practiced answers, smiles that barely needed effort anymore. But I noticed how often he watched me now, his eyes lingering longer than they should, searching for something he couldn't quite name. And I noticed how I never gave him enough to find it. He had begun to tread softly, as if circling something fragile, something that might break if touched too hard. There was no anger in him. Not yet, just a quiet suspicion growing like ivy between the spaces of our shared life, curling around the words we didn't say. It was the morning after one of those long awkward silences over breakfast when I caught the first real crack beneath his surface. David stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the sky shift from gray to gold. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. The words landed too quietly, almost softer than the sound of the kettle clicking off behind me. I stood frozen at the sink, my hands damp from the dishes, fingers still curled around the edge of a cup. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like I could taste it. I met his eyes across the space of our kitchen, the familiar walls closing in just slightly as the air between us thickened. "I'm right here," I answered. It was true and it wasn't. He nodded, as if he'd expected the lie, as if he already knew there was no use pushing harder. His gaze dropped to the floor and I watched him swallow whatever else he wanted to say. I moved toward him, then reached out, let my hand settle gently against his arm, squeezing lightly the way I had done 1,000 times before. The gesture was so practiced it almost felt sincere. Later that day, when he left for work, I stood at the door longer than usual, watching the tail lights of his car disappear down the street. The guilt pressed against me like a weight I could barely shoulder. But it wasn't enough to make me stop. Not anymore. The message I sent was deliberate. No pretense this time, no excuses. We need to talk. The reply came slower than usual. A single word. Come. When I arrived, the house was dark, the only light spilling from the half-open door of the garage. The music was softer this time, barely more than a hum beneath the heavy quiet of the evening. Richard was there, sitting on the edge of the workbench, head lowered, elbows resting on his knees, as though he had been waiting for this particular moment longer than either of us wanted to admit. I stepped inside slowly, the air thick with the smell of oil and wood. He didn't look up right away, his hands clasped loosely together, knuckles white from the grip. When he finally raised his head, the anger I half expected wasn't there. What I saw instead was worse sadness. You told me once I could stop this if I wanted to, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, slow, deliberate. I remember. I swallowed hard, the words scraping their way up from the place where I'd been holding them down. I don't want to. The silence that followed stretched too long, thick enough to drown in. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, searching, measuring, waiting for something that might save either of us from what we both already knew was true. When he finally stood, the movement was slow, careful, like a man approaching the edge of a ledge, knowing the ground beneath his feet was already giving way. You should go, he said. But he didn't move aside. He didn't open the door. Instead, he stepped closer, his hands reaching for me with the same quiet ache that had marked every touch between us. His fingers brushed the line of my jaw, traced the curve of my neck, slid down to the place where my pulse hammered hardest beneath my skin. That I leaned into him, my body answering before my mind could catch up. His mouth found mine again, slower this time, sadder, not hungry, not demanding, but full of the kind of need that comes when two people know they're already losing more than they can bear. We didn't speak after, not right away. We stood there in the quiet, my head resting lightly against his chest, his hand at the back of my neck, fingers threading softly through my hair. But the words came anyway. They always did. This won't end well, I whispered. His breath stirred the strands of hair at my temple as he answered. No, it won't. And still neither of us let go.